we're going to begin. This lesson and next lesson are the two hardest to teach, but most important. This is where the whole Bible is heading. This is the main story of the Bible. This is where everything is going. This is why this is the most important lesson, this lesson and next lesson. But very, very, very difficult for me to teach. I think it's interesting when you read in the Bible just the things that happened when Jesus was crucified. It's kind of matter of fact. It's not a lot of details. And so we kind of have to imagine what it would have been like and imagine, we really even can't, imagine all that. And when I teach, I want to get across that it really was a big deal, but it's hard to even put all that in words. So I'm just going to say a prayer that the Lord will help me in teaching this, especially since I've been sick and a lot of stuff's been going on lately. So let's say a prayer and we're going to begin. Heavenly Father, I thank you for bringing us here today. I thank you for giving me enough health to be able to be here. I pray that you would sustain me through this class, especially with the difficult lesson that we're going to be talking about today. I pray, Lord, that what I say would be accurate, would be true, would glorify you, and would be what we all need to hear today. In your name we pray, amen. All right, so let's go ahead and I'm going to have you guys sing this without me singing because my voice is totally shot. So, ready? New Testament. Matthew, Mark. All right, so we're going on with the minor prophets of the Old Testament. So this week it's Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, and Nahum. All right, so we're going to go ahead and sing the whole Old Testament anyway. Here we go. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, and 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Job, in the book of Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, now the puppet, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, Daniel, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, then comes Malachi. All right, we're going to go ahead and jump right into the gospel era. I'm not going to do the Old Testament review this week. If you were here last lesson, we actually did a review of the whole Old Testament time, even through the Intertestament time, when we learned why people celebrate Hanukkah. But we're scooting ahead now to the New Testament, and we remember that Rome is in control of everything, which is not something that makes the Jewish people happy. So in waiting for Messiah, they're waiting for someone who's going to come and free them from their enemies, the Romans, right? Which would have been nice, which would have made things easier for them during that little time that they lived on the timeline, but it would not have helped them eternally. They would have died in their sins and still had to pay for their sins, right? So that's really not why the true Messiah came the first time. We said that in our lessons, most of the time Jesus spent his ministry up in this area, but he has moved down now, and getting closer to the time of the cross, he's moved down now to the area of Jericho and Judea and Perea here. We said that this is kind of what that would have looked like. So this is a very deep rift, or very deep valley, the Jordan River Valley. Jericho is down here near the Dead Sea, well below sea level. So the Mediterranean Sea over here, maybe at this level, and the Dead Sea is well below sea level in Jericho. So the road from Jericho up to Jerusalem, which is up in mountains, would have been a steep, windy wilderness road. So we said that Jesus had gone down to Jericho, and then he went up, that road, up to the area near Jerusalem. Remember last time we said that Jerusalem is the city of Jerusalem, especially where the temple is on a mountain ridge. In the Old Testament, what was that mountain ridge called? This is where Abraham took his son. Close. That's the next one. No, that's down in Egypt. Moriah, right. So the mountain ridge of Moriah, where Abraham had taken Isaac, and God almost had Abraham sacrifice Isaac. But the point is, later we realize God is saying, I'm going to sacrifice my own son here to pay for your sin. And so in providing a ram instead of Isaac, that's like saying, I'm going to provide the sacrifice instead of you having to pay for your sins on that mountain ridge. So the fact that they have the temple there and they were offering sacrifices there is very, very interesting, because that is where 2,000 years before Abraham had taken Isaac. Now, there is a valley to the east. So if the sun comes up there, here's your mountain ridge of Moriah. You have a valley called the Kidron Valley. Now, what's the next mountain ridge right next to it? Mount of Olives, okay? Now, these aren't huge mountain, like Colorado with mountain, snow. These are kind of hills. So you have the mountain ridge of the Mount of Olives, you have the Kidron Valley, and then you have Mount Moriah where the temple was. So when Jesus went up to the area around Jerusalem, he stayed with some friends on the Mount of Olives, just on the other side where the sun would come up, on the other side of the Mount of Olives, in a town called Bethany. About 120 years ago, this is what the ruins of Bethany looked like. Someone took a picture of it. So there's actually ruins there. This is the Mount of Olives. If you were looking at it 100 some years ago, if you're looking at it probably from where the temple was. So there's the Kidron Valley, and there's the Mount of Olives. On the other side of that would have been Bethany, where Jesus' friends, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus lived. Here's another picture of the Mount of Olives, that whole ridge over there, taken from, this is the Temple Mount. So down here is the Kidron Valley, and that's the ridge. Here's another view of the Mount of Olives. So this is the Kidron Valley. This is probably taken from where the temple is. So over on the other side of that mountain ridge is Bethany. We talked about last week how Jesus had friends there, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. We talked about the story about how Martha was serving and she kind of overdid it, and Mary was sitting at Jesus' feet, and Martha got angry with Mary, and basically Jesus said, listen, it's right to serve, right? We want to serve the kingdom. We need to serve God in his kingdom. We're all going to have a calling and a place, something we're to do in God's kingdom. But we can get so crazy with that, wanting to do a good job for the Lord, that we don't spend time with him personally. And so Jesus said, that's the most important thing, is that you spend time with me personally. Yes, we're supposed to serve, but we're also supposed to spend time with him one-on-one, just hearing from him, being taught by him. So it was like basically Jesus saying, Martha, I want you to have that too. I want you to experience that too. So we said that Jesus went into the city to celebrate the Feast of the Dedication, right? Feast of the Dedication. This is December. So what do we call that holiday now? The December holiday, Hanukkah, right? So Jesus was celebrating Hanukkah, and this is where the religious leaders came up to him and said, okay, just tell us, are you the Messiah? Are you the Christ? Are you the anointed one? Of course, they're not going to believe him. They're trying to get him to say so, and then they can say, see, that's wrong. You're against our Jewish law. You can be put to death. And so he pretty much says that. He says, yes, and he just says, I and my Father are one. And so they're like ready to put him to death. They are ready to stone him to death, even though that's illegal, according to the Romans. Even though the Romans are like, you can't just go around executing people because they broke your little religious law. We're the law around here, the Romans would say. You can't just, if anybody's going to execute anybody, we're going to do it, and it's going to be according to our laws. But sometimes the Jews would execute people or stone people to death anyway, and probably the Romans just kind of went, oh well, whatever, they're just Jews, right? So they probably didn't care too much, but it wasn't legal. And so they're getting ready to stone Jesus to death, and this is not the time. Feast of the Dedication is not the time, and it is not the way. It's not the method how it's going to happen. So we don't know how, but Jesus just walks away. He just escapes them. He goes to the area around, just around Jericho, around Perea, and it was at that time, maybe a few months later, a couple weeks later, we don't know, sometime after December, between December and March, he gets word that his friend Lazarus is very sick. And instead of going and healing Lazarus, or even thinking it and healing Lazarus even from a distance, he does not heal Lazarus on purpose. He allows Lazarus to die. And that seems like it's really hard because the family was suffering and sorrowful and it just seemed like, why would he let these great friends of his have to go through this suffering? But he said, this is for glory. Not that Jesus is going to say, hey, praise me more. You're going to see more about Jesus through this whole thing. As hard as it is, as much as you have to suffer, you're going to see more about Jesus than you've ever seen before. So when he gets there and finds out, Lazarus has been dead for 4 days, he has this conversation with Martha. And Martha's like, well, I know he's going to rise again way in the future when everybody's going to rise from the dead. Everybody who has believed in God and been faithful to God, we're all going to rise again. Well, she's right in a sense, but Jesus wants her to know the reason that's going to happen is because of Jesus. Jesus is like, I'm the resurrection. I'm the one that's going to make this happen. I am why resurrection is going to happen. And then to kind of prove his point, or make a kind of a illustration there that they can really see, he raises Lazarus from the dead. And so this body of Lazarus, which had been decaying, God makes it back whole again. Now Lazarus did not rise up and have a perfect body, right? He had a body like he had before. No one rose again with a perfect body until Jesus did. We'll find out when Jesus rises from the dead, he's going to have this perfect, what we call glorified body. And he's like, I'm the first one that's happened to, but I'm a guarantee that that's going to happen to you all. So when we rise again, at some point, he's going to raise us up and give us perfect new bodies. It's going to be wonderful. But Lazarus' body was just like it was before. So Lazarus was going to have to die again. But he was making a point that he was the one that would bring resurrection and life. But we also see that Jesus, he was very sorrowful. He cried through this whole thing. He was really probably angry at sin, angry at death, angry that this is what has to happen with the people that he loves and the creation that he made. So you see that he felt it very deeply. He wasn't just like, hey, it's going to be cool, wait until it. He felt their anger, their sorrow, their grief. He felt it very, very deeply. So we can remember that when we go through things that when we're suffering, Jesus isn't happy about it. And he's not like, it's okay, it's going to be fine later. He feels it just as much as we do. He knows how we feel. He goes through that with us. So many people knew that Jesus had raised Lazarus from the dead. So it wasn't just a lesson for them. The timing of Lazarus' resurrection and the place where it was, right there near the Mount of Olives, right near the time of the Passover, all of that plays into God's plan. And so many people found out that Jesus had raised Lazarus from the dead. So now the religious leaders are like, man, everybody's believing Jesus now, especially since he raised Lazarus from the dead. They didn't doubt that Jesus had raised Lazarus from the dead. They knew he had done that. And still they're not going to believe. In fact, they're getting so crazy, they're like, we better put Lazarus to death so that he can't go around telling everybody that Jesus raised him from the dead. That's how crazy they're getting. But as all of this is happening and people are like, Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, this is a big deal. I mean, he was 4 days dead. He was decaying. That's a big deal. And so now we're getting close to the time of the Passover. And people are starting to travel into Jerusalem. They're coming into town from all over the place. And they're talking about the Lazarus thing. That's a big deal. Now we remember that Jesus had dinner over at Mary and Martha's, or at a guy named Simon's house, which may have been Martha's husband, we don't know. But Mary, Martha, and Lazarus was there. Mary came in and anointed Jesus with sweet-smelling perfume. And she got criticized for it from the disciples, like, you're wasting money. And Jesus stood up for her. And Jesus said, there's more meaning to it than you know. He said, she has just anointed my body for burial. Now people are like, what is he talking about? What do you mean burial? What? And I'm sure she didn't realize she just was doing the best she could for him. And he put more meaning on what she did. He said, this is for burial. My body has been anointed for burial. So they're kind of getting these clues that something's about ready to happen. And Jesus said, the Passover is in a few days away, and the Son of Man is going to be betrayed. He's going to be beaten. He's going to be killed. He's going to rise again. And they just didn't get it. They still didn't understand it. So here we are. It's the week of the Passover week. Maybe that dinner with Mary and Martha and Lazarus, where Mary anointed him, that might have been Saturday evening. But now it's Sunday morning. And Jesus gets up and he's Again, he's staying on the other side of the Mount of Olives in Bethany. And he and his disciples are walking along, and there's another little town nearby called Bethphage. And he says to a couple of his disciples, go into that town, and you will see a donkey and its colt tied up together. A colt that nobody's ever ridden on before. I want you to untie them and bring them to me. And if anybody says, hey, why are you taking these donkeys? Just say the Lord has need of them, and they'll let you do that. So they go into town, and sure enough, there's a mama donkey, and it's the little colt next to the mama. And they untie him, and somebody's like, what do you think you're doing? You're untying him. He says, listen, the Lord has need of them. And so they said, okay, you can take them. So they bring them to Jesus. Okay, so again, we're on the other side of this hill here, or maybe at the top of the hill over nearby. And the disciples are starting to kind of figure this out. So there's one of the Old Testament prophets, Zechariah, said this way back, hundreds of years before. It said, say to the daughter of Zion, right? Say to the Israelites, say to the people of Jerusalem, behold, your king is coming to you. Humble, mounted on a donkey, on a colt, on the foal of a beast of burden. So they're like, this is this prophecy. And they've always been, when is the Messiah going to ride into the city on this colt of a donkey? When is this going to happen? So the disciples are figuring this out. Hey, he's doing this. It's happening. He's coming to be our king. And so they start putting their cloaks on the donkey, or on this colt of a donkey, and they sit Jesus up on it. Probably they have the mama nearby so the colt stays calm. And they start putting their cloaks on the roadway, and Jesus is going to make his way down this mountain into the city. And more people are gathered around. And remember, people are like, this is the one who raised Lazarus. This has got to be the one. So people are gathering around, and they're like, this is it. This is finally it. Now, there are times before when they'd tried to make Jesus king. And Jesus was like, no, he wasn't having it. But now, he's set this whole thing up. He has set this up. It's fulfillment of prophecy. This is the day. And so as they're walking in, all these people are starting to gather around. They're waving palm branches. Now, we might say that's just like, oh, we'll just grab something and kind of wave it. No, for the Israelites to wave palm branches, that was a symbol of saying victory. Victory in battle. Victory over her enemies. That's what waving palm branches meant. So they're waving these palm branches, victory over her enemies. And they're praising Jesus as he's riding down into the city, down that mountain. And they're saying this, Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest. What they're doing is they're quoting Psalm 118. They're quoting a psalm that they always would sing at Passover. It's a psalm that kind of would help them remember, hey, Passover is when, remember, the Israelites were in Egypt and they were slaves and God sent all the plagues, and the final plague was they had to take the lamb and they had to put the blood of the lamb on the doorway. They had to get inside because that night the death angel was going to pass over the land. And if you went inside your house with the blood of the lamb on the door and you weren't ready to go, the firstborn in your household would die. So all over Egypt, children and even adults that were firstborn were dying. But in where the Israelites were, they had the blood of the lamb on the door. They were inside and they were supposed to be ready. So God had told them, you get your dinner ready, keep your shoes on, have your clothes ready to go. You are ready. You're going out tonight. So you don't have time to put yeast, what they call leavening, in your bread and let the bread rise. You don't have time for that. So make bread that doesn't have any leavening, just flat bread. Just make that. Take that lamb whose blood you put on the door. You roast that for your dinner. You eat and you be ready to go. And you watch and you wait and you be ready. At night, the angel went over and passed over their homes and nothing happened to them. There was no judgment. But remember, the Pharaoh was like, get out. Just get out of here. We don't want you here. Get out. And all of Egypt was like, here, take our stuff, take our gold, take our silver. Just get out of here. And they got free. And then what happens? They go across the Red Sea, and then the Red Sea covers up the whole Egyptian army. And what do? They sing a victory song. Victory over our enemies. They sing this victory song. We've gotten free. We've been set free. And then what does God do? He takes them to Mount Sinai and he makes a covenant with them. You keep these laws, I will take care of you. I'll take you into the land. You keep these laws. And that's what became their main covenant. We call it the Old Covenant or the law. So now we have these people that are waiting and waiting. When is the Messiah going to come? Here he's riding into town. They're waving victory branches. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. They're singing a psalm that they would sing about Passover to remind them of how God had given them victory. But it's also a psalm to say he's coming back and he's going to bring victory again. So when they said, Hosanna, that means, Lord, save us. Save us. So they're out there saying, Hosanna, save us. What do they want to be saved from? The Romans, right? And they call him the Son of David because they know, or they're believing at this moment, that he is the descendant of David, the one that's going to be their king. And so Mark tells us that they said, blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David. Luke says, blessed is the king who comes in the name of the Lord. Now, if you're up in the temple area, and there's this big fortress right next to the temple. It's called the Antonia Fortress. It was really connected right to the temple court area. So right there would be all these Roman soldiers. And especially at Passover, they would bring in a lot more Roman soldiers because they knew all these Jewish people were coming to town at Passover. And Passover is a celebration of freedom from our enemies. So they don't want anything happening. They don't want anybody to say, get any ideas and say, hey, let's get rid of the Romans. Let's just get a big battle going here. So they sent in more soldiers. And they had the governor in there, and they're all watching to make sure. They can look from this fortress and look down at the temple courts and make sure everything's staying calm, no riots going on, nobody getting some weapons together. Imagine they're sitting there by their fortress, and they're listening to this as they're walking down this whole procession of people coming down the mountain. They can hear it, talking about a kingdom, talking about a king, victory, save us. I'll bet they're like, uh-oh, what's going on over there? Maybe the governor, his name was Pilate, maybe, I don't know. Maybe he sent a couple soldiers. You better go check this out. Are we having a problem over here? Who is this king? Is he coming in here with weapons? Is he coming in here? And when they went over there, they're saying, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, save us. They see this king, and it's Jesus riding down the mountain. He doesn't look like he's going to have a big rebellion. He doesn't look like somebody who's going to get a bunch of weapons and start a big army. But the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the religious leaders, they're mad too. Because the Romans are going to get mad, and they're not going to let us celebrate our holidays, and they won't let us go worship in the temple anymore. And of course, the Sadducees, they were getting rich off of being religious leaders. And they liked this whole setup that they had with the Romans. They're like, we can't let them Romans get mad. So they went over to Jesus and they said, teacher, you need to get mad at all these people. You need to tell them to stop. Do you hear what they're saying? That they're saying you're a king. And all these other people are joining in. Why are they joining in? Because this guy raised Lazarus from the dead. He's got to be the one. And Jesus answered them and said, I tell you, if these people were silent, the stones would cry out. I'm not going to tell them to be quiet. This is the time that Jesus set up for people to say, here he is. The king is riding into the city. And as Jesus is riding into the city, what do you think he's doing? What do you think a king would do? He's riding into the city and everybody's cheering. Most kings would be like, thank you very much. Yes, I see you over there. Yes, thank you, thank you. That's not what Jesus was doing. He was crying. He was weeping. Now, certainly, he knows all these people are not going to cheer him in a few days. He knows in a few days people are going to call out for him to be crucified. He knows what's coming. But he's not crying for himself. He's crying for the people of Jerusalem. Because he also knows this. He knows they're going to turn against him. He knows they're not going to receive him as their true king, because he's not going to do what they want him to do. They want him to overthrow the Romans, and he's not going to do it. He's going to end up getting killed. And they're like, what's that all about? And he knows, and about 40 years later, in AD, Anno Domini 70, the Romans are going to come in and wipe the city out. Kill a whole bunch of them, tear down the temple, The Romans are going to come and destroy the city. He knows this is coming. And so he's crying as people are cheering him, calling him the king. He's riding into the city and he says this, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, if only you had known on this very day, it would have really given you peace." You know that Psalm 118 that they were quoting? There's a verse in there that you've probably heard. It goes like this. It says, "This is the day that the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it." You ever heard that verse? We can say that about every day, right? This is the day. God made this day. There are many things we can rejoice about, right? But in the Psalm, the day they're talking about is the day the king rides into town. Know that? So when they're saying in the Psalm, this is the day, they're talking about the day that the Messiah rides into town, the day that the king rides into the city. So Jesus says, if you've known on this day, like this is the day, and you don't even know what will really give you peace. You want peace from the Romans? That's not a lasting peace. That's not the peace that you need. You need peace with God. And you don't get it. It's hidden from your eyes and you can't understand it. And the days are going to come before too long, before your enemies are going to tear down this city. They won't leave one stone upon another because you did not know the time of your visitation. You didn't know the time when God himself, in the flesh, visited you. Your king rode into the town and visited you. So he goes into the town. This was Sunday. We call it Palm Sunday or a triumphal entry. What a glorious day, and yet Jesus knows. He knows what's coming. The next Sunday is going to be even better, but we'll have to talk about that next lesson. All right, so we know that probably on Monday and Tuesday, several things that Jesus did. Remember that before he had to go back and go into the temple and make everybody leave that were selling things. Well, this is happening again. So it's almost Passover, and the religious leaders have set up all these tables, and they're selling all these animals and charging people all this money. It's mass chaos. And so Jesus goes, makes whips again, and throws them out. And he said, my house is a house of prayer for all nations. And you're making it a den of robbers. Remember the court of the Gentiles? The Gentiles could only go so far, and there was a little barrier. They couldn't go into where the temple was. They could only go up to the edge of the barrier. Pretty important. We're going to talk about that barrier later in another lesson. They could only go up to that barrier. That's as close as they could get. And if there's all these people in the way, they can't get there. They can't hear what's going on. If they wanted to pray, they couldn't. It was just too noisy and too chaotic. And Jesus says, my house is a house of prayer for all nations, not just for the Jewish people. But you've made it a den of thieves. So he went through all of that again. We know he did some teaching. He did some healings. He taught some parables, especially parables about the kingdom that's coming. And here's how you are to live until the final kingdom comes. He warned people about false teachers. And he told, especially his disciples, he told them, here's some things that are going to happen in the future. Some of the things in the quick future, but things that are going to happen in the far future when Jesus comes back again. Some of those things haven't even happened yet. So he does these things on Monday and Tuesday. Wednesday, most scholars think, was a quiet day. He's over there in Bethany, staying with Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, staying with his friends. And we don't know that he did anything in the city. All right? Not that he was taking, not that he was taking a holiday. This is great, I'm taking a holiday. He knows what's coming. He knows it's going to come the next day. Wednesday was a quiet day. Now we're on Thursday. Thursday at sundown, we begin the Passover holiday. Passover holiday actually was 2 holidays put together, and it would last a whole week. Remember that the religious leaders were like, we want to get him. They made this deal with Judas. You can tell us where he is when nobody knows where, when we can sneak and get him and nobody sees it. Because everybody's like, you can't go arrest the guy that raised Lazarus from the dead. Why would you do that? So they can't just go in front of all the crowds and grab Jesus. People are going to get mad because this is the guy that raised Lazarus from the dead. Now they've all just cheered him as the Messiah. And so they made this deal with Judas. When nobody sees, let us know when he's off by himself and we can get him. But not during the Passover. We got to wait till everybody goes home and things are quiet. But Jesus says, this is the time. This is the time. And so he tells his disciples, tonight, this evening, I'm going to celebrate the Passover with you. Well, he probably has done this in the past. He's like, I'm really, really want to celebrate this Passover with you. So he sent a couple of people into town, into Jerusalem, and he said, you go on the other side of town, and there's going to be a man walking around with a water pot. And you go ask that man with a water pot where we can celebrate the Passover, where I and my disciples can celebrate the Passover. And he'll show you a room. So sure enough, they found this man with a water pot, and they said, where can Jesus and his disciples celebrate the Passover? So the man takes them to his house, and the house has an upstairs room. So that's why we believe it was over on this side of the city, what we call the upper city, because that's where the richer people live. And richer people would have had a second story. If you were poor, you didn't have a house that big. So anybody who had a second story in their house probably rather rich in those days. So probably the upper room house, the house that they went to, was over on that side of the city. Oh, there's one. So they get over there, and the guy says, okay, you can have my upstairs room. And it's all furnished, it's all ready to go. So Jesus' disciples go there that evening. Now, we don't know the exact order of how things happened. I've read the 4 Gospels, and they all tell different things, but they tell them in different orders. So I don't know the exact order of how things went, but we do know that during the dinner at some point, Jesus is saying that, one of you is going to betray me. And they're all like shocked by this. Everybody but Judas, of course. I think Judas is shocked that he knew. I don't know. How did he find that out? One of you is going to betray me. And they're all like, is it going to be me? Is it going to be me? He says, it's somebody that's eating this dinner with me tonight. It's somebody that's dipping their bread in this big stew bowl, because they're all dipping it the same. Somebody tonight that's doing this is going to betray me. So maybe when he said that, maybe that sparked a conversation, but they start getting this conversation about who's the greatest. They've done this before, right? Well, I'm the greatest. Well, in the kingdom, I'm going to be his right-hand guy. No, he saw me first. I'm the oldest. Well, no, I'm the smartest. So they're arguing with each other about who's the greatest in the kingdom, right? Judas is still there. They're arguing about this, and Jesus says something very surprising. He doesn't say anything. He doesn't say, are we doing this again, guys? Haven't we gone through? He doesn't say anything. He just stands up. He takes out off his outer cloak. He wraps a towel around his waist, and he bends down on the floor and starts washing the disciples' feet. Now remember, that's a job that the lowest servant would do. It's disgusting, it's smelly, and, Jesus is the greatest one at this table, greatest one ever, and he's down there washing the disciples' feet. Now the disciples it didn't occur to them to wash each other's feet. It didn't even occur to them to wash Jesus' feet. That's what you do before you have a meal and everything. Somebody's supposed to wash your feet. They didn't even think about that. And here Jesus is washing their feet, and they're ashamed, and they're shocked. And when he gets done, he says, do you understand what I had just done to you? He said, you call me teacher and Lord or master, and you're right, because that's what I am. So if I'm your teacher and your master, and I have washed your feet, shouldn't you follow my example and do what I have done to you? I tell you the truth, a servant, which is what they were, a servant is not greater than the master. A messenger isn't greater than the one that gives them the message. You're not greater than I am, he said. And I am acting as a servant to you. So you should act as servants to one another. You're talking about who's the greatest? The greatest is the one that's going to be the servant of all. And then he says, I'm not speaking about all of you. The scripture must be fulfilled. One of you, whom I have chosen. This isn't a surprise. This isn't, things are going wrong. Jesus chose Judas. Jesus knew. One of you whom I've chosen, who has eaten with me, who has been close to me, will betray me. I'm telling you this before it happens, so that when it does happen, you will believe that I am who I say I am. Many times in the Old Testament, he would say this. When a prophet says, God says this is going to happen, and he's telling you in advance, so when it happens, you'll know he's God, because he knows it's going to happen. Jesus says, I'm telling you it's going to happen. This is not catching me by surprise. This is not out of the plan. So that you know I'm in control, so that you know I am who I say I am, I'm telling you in advance, this is going to happen. And at some point, he says to Judas, what you need to do, go do it quickly. And Judas gets up, Satan enters Judas, and he leaves. Right? Judas is greedy. Judas really doesn't want anything to do with making Jesus the Messiah. He doesn't care. He's selfish. Satan uses that. Satan enters Judas, and Judas heads off. Now the disciples think, they're clueless. They have no idea. It doesn't cross their mind that Judas would be the one. Judas must have seemed so loyal. He was in charge of the money bags and didn't, so they're thinking he's going out to buy some more things that they need. But Judas is heading over to talk to the Pharisees and the religious leaders to say, I know where he's going to be tonight. He's going to go to a garden. We always go through that garden. It'll only be him and his disciples, and it'll be dark. It's a good place where you can get him. So Jesus sends him out at the right moment. Judas heads away. Now, I don't know if that was before they had the supper part or after. But during the supper, which is when they're supposed to, celebrate the Passover and remember what happened with Moses in Egypt and the Israelites. And they're supposed to take this bread, and it's not leavened bread, it's flat bread. And the youngest person is supposed to ask the older person, so it's probably John, would ask Jesus, why do we eat bread that doesn't have any leavening in it, doesn't have any yeast? And the older person is supposed to say, it's because the Israelites didn't have time to put yeast in their bread, and they ate unleavened bread. So we're remembering that. And then they're supposed to say, well, why do we do this? Why do we have lamb? And they're supposed to say, well, it's because of this. So maybe John had asked him the question about the bread. But Jesus changed everything. So he says, this bread, he doesn't talk about Egypt and all that. He says, this bread is my body broken for you. You take this and eat it to remember me. Now, if I'd been one of the disciples, I would have been like, looking at bread like, that's the way it goes. What does he mean? What's he talking about? This is his body. Obviously he didn't think it was his actual body. He's sitting right there. Pieces of him were not disappearing as they were eating the bread, right? They know it's a symbol. Remember when Jesus said, I'm the bread of life, and you're supposed to eat me? People were like, I don't want to eat him, and people walked away. He wasn't saying literally eat his literal body. If you were to take me and I'm what sustains you, I'm what gives you life, right? So now he's saying this bread, it's a symbol. It's a symbol of my body, which is broken for you. Now, broken? What does he mean by broken? He doesn't look broken to me. He's just sitting right there. What does he mean his body's broken? And why do I need to remember him? He's sitting right there. I haven't forgotten him. What does this mean? He didn't say anything. He took it. And then he takes the cup of wine, and he's supposed to say something about the Passover and all that. He doesn't say that. And he said, this cup that has been poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood. He passed it around. Drink this to remember me. As often as you get together, take the bread and the cup and you remember me. Now they don't know what he's talking about, his blood. They do know that when you made covenants, very often you took the blood of an animal and you sprinkled it on the covenant to make it for sure. In fact, when God gave the covenant to Moses and the 10 Commandments and all of that, Moses killed an animal and sprinkled blood on the covenant and sprinkled blood on the people. Ew, but that's what he did. That's to say this covenant is for real. It's serious. So there was always blood that was involved with covenants. So to say this is a new covenant in my blood, well, okay, blood and covenants were often associated, but why his blood? And what does he mean, the new covenant? Why is there a new covenant? We've had the law for all these years. What's this new covenant? Well, one of the prophets, Jeremiah, had said, God says he's going to have to make a new covenant with you. And it's not going to be like the old covenant. It's not going to be like the law. Why? Was the law bad? Did God make a bad covenant with them? No, the law was perfect. The problem was they weren't, and they couldn't keep it, right? The hundreds and hundreds of years showed nobody could keep the law. What was the first commandment? No other gods. None of us can do that. Do you know who our number one God is? Ourselves. That's who we want to please. We're selfish. We are born that way. That's what sin is, right? So even if well, I worship money. I want money. I want it. Why? Because I want it for myself, right? Well, our number one God is really often ourselves. And we need the Lord to change us and worship him and put him first, right? So they have not been able in hundreds of years to keep the first commandment of that covenant. It wasn't that the covenant was bad. And Jeremiah says, the new covenant's not going to be like that because you couldn't keep that one. But God says, I'm going to bring a new covenant. I'm going to make this covenant change you on the inside. And all these years, I go, what is this new covenant going to be? When is it coming? What is he talking about? And now Jesus announces, this is the new covenant. This cup of wine represents the new covenant in my blood. Remember me with this. Now they're confused. They don't know what it means, that in a few hours, Jesus is going to be hanging on a cross. His body would be broken and beaten. His blood would be pouring out, and he would be making a covenant while he's hanging on that cross. And in that covenant, he says, you can't keep the law. I did. I kept the old covenant. Now I'm paying for your judgment because you couldn't keep it. Now, what's the new covenant? Do we have to keep a bunch of rules? No, Jesus did that. The new covenant is we believe that he paid the punishment for us. And that's how we're accepted by God. That's a better deal, isn't it? Isn't that better than having to try to keep a bunch of laws that you can't keep? The new covenant is trust what Jesus did on the cross for you. But they don't get that. They will later. But that's what we get it now. And that's why when we come together in our churches, we're supposed to every now and then we're supposed to take that little cracker or whatever, a piece of bread. We're supposed to eat that together, all together, remembering that Jesus died on the cross for our sins. We're supposed to drink that little juice to remember that Jesus poured out his blood for us, that there's a new covenant in his blood. Why? You know, Jesus commanded us to do this. It's a commandment. You know that? We don't have too many commandments under the new covenant. One of them is, do this. Why? Because we forget. And he knows we forget. We're forgetful people. I mean, very often you could probably go a whole day without even remembering that Jesus really died for you and thinking about that and making that important in your life, right? We forget. So we need to come together and remind each other, and that's a way to remind each other. When you eat that little cracker, when you're drinking that little juice, you're remembering what he did on the cross for you. You're remembering that you are now part of the new covenant. So he tells them, you're supposed to do this. But they don't understand. They don't know why he's doing that. Now, I don't know if this is before Judas left or after Judas left. Depends on which gospel you're reading. It doesn't really give us all that information. When they finish this, John in his gospel gives us about little more than 4 chapters of things that Jesus said to his disciples. It's as though Jesus knows, I don't have much time. In a few hours, you're going to be totally messed up. You're going to be so confused. You're going to run away. You're going to think that the whole world is falling apart. You're going to think the whole plan of God is falling apart. You're not going to understand things. You're going to think everything's messed up. He knows they're going to be frightened. They're going to be overwhelmed with grief. And he just starts pouring stuff out. If you read those chapters, the end of chapter 13, 14, 15, 16, and chapter 17 in the book of John, it's Jesus he's in that upper room. Maybe they've walked out to the garden by this time. He's just pouring his heart out to them. And he says, we're going to talk later about some of the things he said, but things like, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. Or in my Father's house are many rooms. I go to prepare a place for you. I'm coming back. And then all of chapter 17 of John is Jesus praying for them. This beautiful prayer. And in that prayer, he says, I'm not just praying for these people. I'm praying for everybody who's going to believe in me. So it's a prayer for us too. It's a beautiful prayer. So all these things just kind of pour out of him. And then they sing a hymn and he's like, it's time to go. And so they get up and they walk towards the temple. They go down the valley into a little garden called Gethsemane in the Mount of Olives. Gethsemane is a word that means olive press. So Mount of Olives, there's a lot of olive trees. So in this garden, there were olive trees, and there was an olive press there where they would put the olives in there, and the big old stone would squish it, and all the juice would run out, and they'd make olive oil, right? Big, heavy, heavy stone. So there was an olive press. That's what the word Gethsemane means. You know that if you go to the Garden of Gethsemane now, there are olive trees that are there that were there 2,000 years ago when Jesus was there. Now, they may have been cut down and little sprigs grown back up, but they're very old trees, and they last a long time. So they go out to the Garden of Gethsemane, and Jesus is overwhelmed with emotion. And this is where it's like we can't even understand. It's one thing to know, okay, that I'm about ready to get executed, and it's going to be painful. And as human beings, we can kind of understand, wow, that would be awful to think about. I'm just about ready to get beaten and spit upon and made fun of and hung on a cross. But what we can't understand is that he, the Son of God, is about ready to take the judgment from God, the Father, for all sins. He's perfect. He's never sinned. He's about ready. We can't even imagine what that was. And so what he was thinking, what he was feeling was overwhelming. And he tells his disciples, I want you to watch and I want you to pray. In the original Passover, the night of watching. Watch. Time is coming. You be watching and be ready. And he's telling his disciples, I want you to watch and pray with me. Pray that you don't enter into temptation. What temptation? Well, it's going to be a hard night. The evening's stuff is going to happen. Are they going to be ready for it? No. They're going to fall asleep. He's telling them to pray, and he says, listen, the shepherd will be struck, I will be struck, and you will all scatter. The sheep will scatter. And Peter's like, no, not me. Even if everybody else runs away, not me. I'll go to prison with you. I will even die with you. And Jesus said, Peter, I tell you that on this very night, before the rooster crows in the dawn, you will have denied even knowing me 3 times. No way. I'll die with you. On tonight, this very night, you will deny knowing me 3 times before the rooster crows in the morning. In fact, he said, Satan has asked for permission from God to sift you like wheat. Satan has asked for permission to destroy you, Peter, but I've prayed for you that when this is over, you will come back and be strong and be able to encourage and strengthen your fellow brothers, your disciples, the other disciples. What are you talking about? Really? How could Peter's like, this couldn't happen? So Jesus kind of goes a little ways away from you. You watch and pray, and he's so overwhelmed, and he's so sorrowful. In fact, Luke says he's so overwhelmed emotionally that sweat is dripping off of him like great drops of blood. He's in agony. I can't even imagine what he would have looked like or what it would have been like. And what is his disciples doing just a little ways away? He needs their support. They're his friends. And they're sleeping. They fall asleep. And he cries out to the Lord and he says, God, if possible, let this cup pass from me. Let this not have to happen to me. Let this not have to happen to me if it's possible. Nevertheless, not my will, but your will be. That's a prayer that we should always pray. I mean, it's okay to go to the Lord and say, here's what I'd love to have happen. Can this happen? Can you take away this sickness that I've had for 2 weeks? Can you heal me? Can you do this? Can you make this work out? Can you make this happen? I would love it if you do. This is what I want. But I know that your will is best. I know you're wiser than I am. I know that you're good. I know that you love me. I know that you want to work things together for your glory and my good. I'm going to trust you with that. Nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done. If Jesus could pray that, knowing what was going to come, we can pray that too. Right? And even if it means suffering, your way is right. I will submit to that. And so Jesus is saying, I will submit to your will. This is the battle that he's fighting. He fought it in the garden, right? My human flesh wants to not do this, but I want to obey and I want to submit to the Father. Do you think if there was another way that God would have Jesus go to the cross? If we could just say some prayers or do some good things, or if there was some way that we could get our sin out of our lives and we could be accepted by God, if there was another way besides Jesus paying for our sins, do you think God would have sent him to the cross? No. It would have been cruel. There wouldn't have been any need for that. There was no other way. And Jesus is saying, I will do what you want me to do. And he keeps going back to his friends, and they're sleeping, and he goes back and he prays some more, and God even sends angels to encourage Jesus. And finally, Jesus goes back to the disciples and wakes them up. He says, get up. It's time. Let's go. My betrayer is at hand. My betrayer is coming. Now, he's not saying, let's get out of here because they're coming after me. He's saying, we're going out of this garden to meet him. We're going towards him. And so they go out of the garden, and coming up the Kidron Valley, there's a group of people with torches, with some swords and some weapons and some clubs. A lot of them were Jewish religious leaders, maybe a few Roman soldiers, and there's Judas walking towards Jesus and the disciples. I thought the disciples were like, Judas? Wait, what's going on? Jesus said, listen, I will go and give the man who you're looking for a kiss on the cheek. That's the way you would greet a friend. I'll go and give him a kiss on the cheek, and that's how you'll know who it is. So Judas walks up to Jesus and gives him a kiss on the cheek. Jesus says, Judas, did you betray the Son of Man with a kiss? You're going to betray the Messiah, the Son of God, with a kiss? Awful. I'm sure, as a human being, it made Jesus, would have hurt my feelings. I don't know how Judas was feeling at the time. So Jesus, turns to all these people that have come to get him, come to arrest him and grab him. He says to them, who are you looking for? And they said, Jesus of Nazareth. He says, I am he. But literally what he said is, I am. Remember the Old Testament, Yahweh, God's name, I am. When he said that, John says, all of these people fell down flat. Can you imagine that? I am. They just fall down. A clue here, people. You're in the presence of God. Why do you think you fell down? In the presence of God. They fall down. And then they get back up. Still going to arrest him. Jesus says, I'm going to ask you again. Who are you seeking? And he said, Jesus of Nazareth. He says, well, I told you I am he. So if you're looking for me, if you're seeking me, you let these other guys go. Let them go. Now Peter's going to be all tough, and he grabs a little sword and he starts swinging it around. I'm going to save you. And he cuts the ear off of a servant of the high priest. Cuts his ear right off. Imagine he's like, and wow, things could have gotten out of hand really fast. And you imagine the soldier like, okay, we got to fight on our hands. And, Jesus puts a stop to it. Picks the ear up, puts it back on, and heals the ear. Hello? He just healed the guy's ear. Still going to arrest him. He turns to Peter and says, do you not realize I could pray to my Father and he would send me thousands of angel soldiers to help me? But how would the scriptures be fulfilled if I don't go ahead with this? If I don't do what he's told me to do? All of this is happening so that the scriptures could be fulfilled. This is not things getting out of hand. This is not messing up God's plan. This is the fulfillment of scripture. Jesus could have gotten himself out of it. He didn't need Peter to swing his little sword around. Jesus could have, and so Jesus puts that to a stop. And the soldiers come forward and they grab Jesus. I don't know if they went after the disciples, but the disciples were scared and the disciples all took off running. They ran, left Jesus there. Now Mark, when he writes his gospel, throws in a really interesting little story. So just a sentence. Mark says that there was this young man, probably a teenager, standing nearby watching the whole thing. And the soldiers actually went and grabbed him. And they grabbed a hold of his cloak, which he'd just thrown on to cover up his body. And he wriggled out of it and he ran away naked. Why does Mark tell us that? I don't know. I'm going to ask him when we get to heaven. And the other, does this have deep spiritual meaning? I don't think so. Why did he say that? You know why some people think he said that? Because Mark at this time would have been a teenager, young man. He lived in Jerusalem. His mom owned a house with an upper room because later the church would meet in that house. Is that Mark? I don't know. You'll ask him when you get to heaven. Is that you? You wrote about, I don't know. But he has a funny little story, so he ran off. So they take Jesus back into the city. They take him back over here to where the rich people lived, because that's where the high priest lived, the Jewish high priest. Caiaphas was his name. They took him to the house of Caiaphas. They first took him to one guy's house. They ended up at Caiaphas' house. And they're going to have a trial in the middle of the night, which, according to Jewish law, was illegal. To throw a trial together, do it in the middle of the night, not be able to have people on both sides to testify. They just threw this trial together in the middle of the night. And so Jesus is in there. Peter has made his way back. He finds out where Jesus is, and he's in the courtyard outside sitting by the fire. And Jesus is in there, and they're just accusing him of all kinds of things. Did you know he said this? I heard him say this. No, he didn't say that. He said this. No, you're wrong. He did this. And they didn't even agree with each other. And they're accusing him of all kinds of things that he didn't do. He just stands there and doesn't say a word. But he's not like going, I didn't say that. No, you misunderstood. He didn't say a word. And so finally the high priest is frustrated. We're not getting anywhere. So the high priest turns to Jesus and says, I insist that you tell us, are you the Christ, the Son of God? Well, they're not going to believe him, right? They want him to. They want him to incriminate himself. They want to put him to death, right? And so he finally speaks up. He says, it is as you have said. But I tell you, from now on, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. What's he talking about? Well, he's quoting from another Old Testament prophet, from Daniel. You know Daniel in the lion's den? Daniel was given a vision by God. And in this vision, Daniel saw something of the God the Father. You can't really see God, but somehow he knew this was God the Father sitting on the throne, ready to judge the nations. And in the clouds coming towards him, out of the clouds walks one, Daniel says, he's like the Son of Man. And he walks right up to the throne. And the Ancient of Days is what he calls God the Father, comes to him and says, here, all the kingdoms are yours. You have authority. I'm giving you all the kingdoms. It's the Messiah. So when Jesus says, you will see me sitting at the right hand of God the Father and then coming in the clouds of glory, they knew what he was talking about. He was claiming to be this one that Daniel saw in his vision. That was enough for them. They tore their clothes. They're so angry with him, saying he's claiming to be equal with God. He has said what is against our law, and it's punishable by death. He deserves to die. But legally, they can't kill him. They got to get the Romans to do it. It's not against the Roman law for him to say he's the Messiah. The Romans don't care. Somehow they've got to convince the Romans that Jesus has done something so bad that the Romans should execute him. In the meantime, Peter's out in the courtyard. And somebody comes up to Peter and says, it's a servant girl. It's a girl, right? Says to Peter, you were with him. You were with that Jesus of Nazareth. And Peter did what we all do. A lot of us do sometimes when we're scared. We lied. Right? We lied sometimes when we're scared. So, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know him. And a little bit later, somebody says, no. I saw you with him. You're one of them. I don't know what you're talking about. I don't even know the man. I don't know what you're talking about. And the third person says, no, you have an accent. I can tell you're from Galilee. You have to be one of those. And Peter, it says, he calls down curses on himself. Kind of like, may God kill me or may God curse me if I'm lying. I don't know the man. Wow. Was he being persecuted? Was he being beaten up? Was somebody about ready to kill him? No. These little servant girls were like, you were around. No, I don't know. And Peter was like, I'll go to death with you. And all of a sudden the servant girl accuses him. He's scared, like, I don't know who he is. And the third time he said, I don't know him, the rooster crowed. And it must have been at that moment that they were taking Jesus out of Caiaphas' house. And they're getting ready to take Jesus over to where the Roman governor is. They've got to convince the Roman governor to put Jesus to death. Because when that rooster crowed, Jesus turned and looked at Peter. Peter saw him. All it took was a look. Peter was dead. servant. Servant girl's like, you were running. I totally said I don't even know him. He's my best friend. He's the Messiah. He's my master. He's the teacher. And I said, I don't know him. And he went out and he just wept bitterly, devastated his own spirit. So now they're going to take Jesus over probably to this fortress here, which is where the governor is. It's early morning. And they've got to do something. They've got to come up with something to convince the Romans that Jesus deserves to die. So that's where we'll pick up our next lesson. We don't have class next week because I'll be out of town. So we have to wait another week after that. So good listening. Thank you.